SpongeBob SquarePants. That's where your childhood lives. SpongeBob, and Disney Channel on a school night, and early YouTube before anyone understood what YouTube was going to become. Fred. Smosh. Charlie bit my finger. You were watching strangers film themselves in their bedrooms before that was a career, before anyone called it content, before the algorithm existed to decide who was worth watching. You had a flip phone in middle school, a smartphone by 10th grade. You remember the exact year those two things were different. Vine was yours, 6 seconds of something genuinely funny, before TikTok arrived and everyone forgot Vine ever happened. Tumblr was your emotional landscape at 15, full of things you felt but hadn't learned to say out loud yet. Instagram was your high school, the first like on a photo you spent 20 minutes choosing, the follower count that felt meaningless and somehow didn't. You were in your early 20s when COVID hit, not a teenager who went home to their parents' house, not an established adult with savings and a career foundation. 22, 24, 26, the exact years meant for building the version of life that carries everything after. And the world went quiet and asked you to wait. Here's the thing about being born between 1993 and 1997. When you were in a room full of millennials, you recognize most of the references, but something is slightly off. The dial-up internet, AIM, the early 2000s in high school, those aren't quite yours. You were too young. When you were around Gen Z, you understand the language, you know the platforms, but you also remember something they don't. A childhood that existed before the phone was the center of everything. You belonged to both, fully to neither. And psychology has a very specific explanation for what that actually does and builds in a person. There is a boundary that runs through the middle of this birth window that most people have never had named to them precisely. In 2019, the Pew Research Center placed the generational dividing line between Millennials and Gen Z at the birth year 1996. That line cuts the 1993 to 1997 cohort almost exactly in half. Half Millennial, by the most widely used definition, half Gen Z. But those definitions were built on broad strokes. The lived psychological reality is more specific than any demographic boundary can capture. What defines this cohort is not which label applies. It is that neither label fully applies. They are bilingual in two generational cultures, fluent in both, native to neither. And the experience of living between two clearly defined identities is one that most generational research has consistently underexamined. Millennials grew up with dial-up internet, pagers, VHS, a childhood built before everything went digital. Gen Z grew up inside screens from early childhood, with no personal memory of a pre-smartphone world. The 1993 to 1997 cohort had a childhood in the early internet era, Club Penguin, Webkins, a computer in the living room, early YouTube as a novelty, and then an adolescence entirely inside the smartphone era, where Instagram and Vine and Snapchat arrived during high school and restructured everything about what teenage social life was. That split, early internet childhood, smartphone adolescence, is a specific psychological condition, and it produced something that neither of the generations on either side of this cohort fully shares. In social psychology, researchers study something called social identity complexity, the way a person's sense of self is shaped when they belong simultaneously to multiple social groups whose memberships don't perfectly overlap. The foundational research, published in 2002 by Sonia Rokas and Marilyn Brewer in the Personality and Social Psychology Review, found that individuals who hold genuinely complex, multiple social identities, who cannot be reduced to a single group membership, develop distinct psychological characteristics, greater cognitive flexibility, stronger capacity for perspective taking, more sophisticated and nuanced self-concept, higher tolerance for ambiguity. The research found this because belonging to multiple overlapping groups requires a person to develop a more complex internal model of themselves. They cannot simply inherit the identity of a single community. They have to construct something more layered, more their own. The 1993 to 1997 cohort holds two genuine generational memberships simultaneously. They have the cultural fluency of late millennials. They remember what childhood felt like before the phone was everything. And the technological nativeness of early Gen Z. They built their adolescent identities entirely inside social media. Neither membership cancels the other. Both are real. And the psychological result of living inside that dual membership, of moving between two generational frames without fully settling in either, is something the research on social identity complexity describes clearly. You didn't get a simpler identity, you got a more sophisticated one. Sonia Rokas and Marilyn Brewer's 2002 paper in the Personality and Social Psychology Review, Social Identity Complexity, drew on decades of research in social and identity psychology to establish what happens when people belong to multiple, overlapping groups simultaneously. Their central finding was this: individuals with high social identity complexity, people whose sense of self cannot be reduced to a single community or category, consistently demonstrate more inclusive, flexible, and adaptive thinking than people whose identities align neatly within a single group. They are better at holding contradictions, better at understanding perspectives that differ from their own, better at functioning in environments that keep changing the rules. The mechanism is developmental. When your identity cannot be borrowed wholesale from a single group, you have to build it yourself. You have to do the more difficult, more deliberate work of figuring out what you actually think, what you actually value, what actually defines you, rather than inheriting it from a cohort. The 1993 to 1997 cohort was never going to get a clean generational identity handed to them. They were born at the seam. Neither generation fully claimed them, and neither fully described them. What that required, the work of building an identity that couldn't be assembled from a single generational template, is exactly what the social identity complexity research identifies as the source of its specific advantages. You were not left without an identity. You were required to construct one. That is harder, and it builds something more durable. Here is what the in-between position actually produced in you. You understand both sides of a cultural conversation that most people can only see one side of. When Millennials and Gen Z are talking past each other, and they do constantly, you are the person in the room who speaks both languages, who can translate, who already has the context for both sets of references because you grew up accumulating both. You are more adaptable to changing platforms, changing formats, changing cultural norms than people who grew up entirely inside one era. Because your entire adolescence required you to adapt in real time. Every 2 years the platform changed, the format changed, the way people communicated shifted, and you kept up, not because you were chasing it, but because you were inside it as it was being built. You also carry something that pure Gen Z doesn't have. The memory of childhood before the phone was the organizing center of everything. SpongeBob on a Tuesday evening, early YouTube as a discovery, not a feed, a version of being young that existed before it was also a performance. That memory is not nostalgia for its own sake. It is a reference point. The internal knowledge of what an uncomplicated version of being yourself felt like, before everything had to be curated. And people who carry that reference point have something to return to when the current version of the world becomes too much. There is one more thing this cohort carries that needs to be said plainly. You were in your early to mid-20s when COVID arrived. The Pew Research Center and every generational framework had already debated which label applied to you. None of that mattered when 2020 came, and the years that were supposed to be yours, the building years, the establishing years, the years when the version of life you'd been working toward was supposed to start taking shape, went quiet. You were 22 to 26, not a teenager sheltered at home, not an established adult with a foundation to retreat to. In the exact window where presence, being in rooms, building things, showing up, is how everything important actually gets constructed. And you waited, and you adapted, and you rebuilt in conditions that nobody had prepared you for, using resources you were still in the process of accumulating. That is not a coincidence of timing. That is the continuation of something this cohort had been doing since adolescence, navigating conditions that kept changing before they were finished, building identity in environments that refused to hold still, finding solid ground in spaces that were still being poured. The mid-90s kids were never handed a clean generational home. They were handed the space between two of them and asked to make something of it. They did. They always do, even when nobody was watching closely enough to see it happen. If this describes something you've felt for years but never heard articulated, subscribe. The next video goes into a part of this generation's experience that most content in this space has completely missed. If this one was accurate, you'll want to hear it.